Michael didn't gloat. He responded graciously to messages, thanked James for his call, and politely declined when Ains offered to show him the hilarious slow-motion video her granddaughter had helped her extract from her phone footage. Instead, he methodically compiled all his documentation, emails, voicemails, photos, timestamps of Brenda's visits to other homes, and of course, the doorbell camera footage, into a single comprehensive file that he submitted to the board on Monday morning. The email was factual, free of emotional language, and ended with a simple request for the board to review not just his gate compliance, but also the pattern of selective enforcement and intimidation tactics that undermines the community trust in HOA leadership. The board, recognizing a potential legal liability when they saw one, acted swiftly. Wednesday's meeting was expanded to include a closed-door executive session before the public portion. When the community members filed in at 7 p.m., Brenda's usual chair at the center of the table was conspicuously empty. James opened the meeting with a statement. The board has accepted Ms. Wilson's voluntary resignation, effective immediately. We thank her for her years of service. The careful phrasing fooled no one, but it allowed for a dignified exit that wouldn't expose the HOA to litigation. The second announcement came as a pleasant surprise to Michael. After reviewing application materials and comparing to current guidelines, Mr. Crawford's security gate has been found fully compliant with all Oak Ridge Estates regulations. James added, with a meaningful look at Michael, the board apologizes for any confusion regarding the approval process. The story could have ended there, with justice served and order restored, but real life rarely ties up so neatly. In the weeks that followed, Michael noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. People stopped to chat when walking past his house, often admiring his gate. The neighborhood book club sent a new invitation. Even the compliance committee members nodded politely when they saw him at the community pool. 6 months later, Michael hosted a neighborhood barbecue that brought together residents who'd barely spoken during Brenda's divisive leadership. James, now the official HOA president, commissioned Diego to design similar gates for the community entrances, citing security enhancement as the primary goal. Over burgers and beers, Ains revealed she'd been documenting Brenda's selective enforcement for years, creating a spreadsheet that showed how rules were applied differently based on friendship and favor. I never had enough proof to do anything with it, she confided. Until you came along with your cameras and your meticulous documentation. The most unexpected development came the following spring. Michael was returning from a morning run with Ziggy when he spotted a familiar figure directing contractors at her home. Brenda, still living in the neighborhood though significantly humbled, was overseeing the installation of her own security gate, one that bore a striking resemblance to Michael's. Their eyes met across the street. For a moment, Michael thought she might pretend not to see him. Instead, after a brief hesitation, she raised her hand in a small, acknowledging wave. Michael returned the gesture before continuing his run. That evening, a small gift basket appeared on Michael's porch with a card bearing just 2 words, "You won." But Michael didn't see it as winning. As he explained to Ains while sharing the expensive chocolates from the basket, sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about making space for something better to grow. And in the case of Oak Ridge Estates, what grew was a more equitable community where gates, both literal and metaphorical, served not to keep people out, but to protect what mattered while still allowing connection to flourish. Even Brenda, it seemed, had learned something in the end. At the next HOA meeting, Michael noticed she sat quietly in the back row. When a new resident's garden trellis was questioned for potentially exceeding height limitations, he watched as Brenda, instead of jumping to condemn, actually pulled out the handbook, found the relevant section, and calmly pointed out that the guidelines had a special exception for climbing plant supports. James caught Michael's surprised expression and whispered, "Some people can actually change when they bounce off enough walls, or gates, as the case may be." Michael smiled. In the grand scheme of things, his reinforced steel gate had protected far more than packages. It had become the boundary that helped reshape an entire community. Michael hadn't planned on becoming the neighborhood rebel, A software engineer who worked from home most days, he'd moved to Oak Ridge Estates for its quiet streets and proximity to hiking trails. The HOA fees were steep, but he figured they were worth it for the well-maintained community spaces and orderly environment. That was until his third package disappearance in a month, this time containing an irreplaceable vintage watch that had belonged to his grandfather. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered, scrolling through security cameras on his laptop. After comparing prices and reviews for days, he finally called Diego, a craftsman whose portfolio featured elegant security solutions that didn't scream fortress. When Diego suggested a reinforced steel gate with a deceptively delicate-looking wrought iron overlay, Michael was sold. "Most people go for the intimidation factor," Diego explained as they reviewed designs. "But I prefer the surprise element. Beautiful on the outside, impenetrable on the inside, like a velvet glove over a steel fist." Michael spent hours poring over the HOA handbook before submitting his application. The guidelines were notorious for their Byzantine complexity. Most residents joked that not even the board members had read the entire thing. Section 4.37 specified acceptable fence heights, no more than 5'2". Materials, wrought iron, natural wood, or powder-coated aluminum, and colors, black, forest green, or estate brown. Michael's design met every requirement, down to the spacing between pickets and the dimension of the decorative finials. 2 weeks after submitting his request, Michael received no response, neither approval nor denial. According to the handbook, failure to respond within 14 days constituted tacit approval. He scheduled the installation for the following Monday, making sure to keep his documentation handy. The morning of installation day arrived with perfect spring weather. Diego and his two-man crew worked with impressive efficiency, the metallic sounds of their labor drawing curious glances from neighbors out for their morning walks. By noon, the concrete footings had been poured, and the gate was taking shape. Michael brought out cold drinks for the workers, feeling a quiet satisfaction as the elegant structure emerged. Mrs. Chen from across the street shuffled over in her gardening clogs, a pair of pruning shears still in hand. She gave an approving nod. "About time someone stood up to those delivery thieves," she said, before lowering her voice. "But watch out for Brenda. She thinks he owns the neighborhood." "I followed all the guidelines," Michael assured her. "Got the measurements exact, chose approved materials and colors." Mrs. Chen chuckled, the sound like dry leaves rustling. "Oh, sweet summer child. Brenda doesn't care about guidelines. She cares about who asks for permission. And you," she pointed a soil-covered finger at his chest, "didn't ask for her personal blessing." As if summoned by her name, a white Tesla pulled up at precisely 2:17 p.m., before the concrete had even dried completely. The vehicle gleamed under the afternoon sun, its electric hum cutting off to reveal the sharp click of designer heels on pavement. Brenda Wilson, HOA president for the past 4 years, emerged wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream pantsuit that probably cost more than Michael's monthly mortgage payment. She surveyed the scene with the air of a general inspecting enemy territory. Her perfectly highlighted hair didn't move in the breeze as she marched toward the gate, phone already in hand. Diego's crew exchanged knowing looks before suddenly finding reasons to be busy at the far side of the yard. "This wasn't approved by the committee," she declared without preamble, snapping photos of the gate from multiple angles. She zoomed in on the decorative scrollwork, then the hinges, as though documenting evidence at a crime scene. "Actually, I submitted the paperwork 2 weeks ago," Michael replied, pulling up the dated form on his phone. "According to Section 2.1, the committee has 14 days to respond, after which—" "I know what the bylaws say," Brenda interrupted, her smile not reaching her eyes. "But the application was clearly never received. Technical glitch, perhaps." She straightened her already perfect posture. "You'll need to remove this immediately and reapply through proper channels. Expect an email within the hour detailing the violation fines that will accrue until it's removed." Behind her, Mrs. Chen rolled her eyes so dramatically that Michael feared for her ocular health. He took a deep breath, reminded himself that he'd documented everything, and maintained his calm. I have the delivery confirmation showing the committee received it, he said, keeping his voice level. And a follow-up email I sent last week asking about status. I'm happy to forward both to the entire board. The email arrived at exactly 3:00 p.m., as if Brenda had timed it to interrupt Michael's work meeting. The subject line, URGENT, code violation notice, was in all caps, complete with a high priority flag. Michael waited until after his call to open it, knowing he needed a clear head to process whatever fabricated violations awaited him. The message cited Section 4.32, Aesthetic Continuity Standards, and claimed his gate created an unwelcome fortress-like appearance incongruent with Oak Ridge's open community values. It demanded removal within 5 days and outlined a daily fine schedule that would quickly reach absurd amounts. At the bottom was Brenda's signature, followed by an inspirational quote about community harmony. Michael felt his blood pressure rising, but forced himself to step away from his computer. He took his coffee to the backyard, breathed deeply, and reminded himself that he had documentation on his side. That evening, he spent 3 hours crafting his response, including photographed examples of 7 similar gates in the community, including one at the vice president's house, a side-by-side comparison of his gate specifications and the HOA guidelines, the delivery confirmation and red receipt for his original application, a respectful but unmistakably firm closing paragraph about selective enforcement. He proofread it twice before hitting send, then poured himself a well-deserved glass of scotch. Brenda's voicemail arrived during his morning shower, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. Listen, we both know that monstrosity doesn't belong here. This isn't some crime-ridden urban neighborhood where people need to lock themselves away. This is Oak Ridge. The thinly veiled classism made Michael's jaw clench. He saved the message, adding it to his growing documentation file. 2 more voicemails followed over the next day, each escalating in hostility. The latest one abandoned any pretense of professionalism. Your stubbornness is being noted, Mr. Crawford. This kind of behavior affects one's standing in the community. Packages going missing might be the least of your problems if you continue to be difficult. That veiled threat was the final straw. Michael consulted the bylaws and submitted a formal request for board review, which would temporarily suspend any fines until a decision was reached. He emailed it to the entire board, not just Brenda, and received a polite confirmation from James, the treasurer, that it would be on the agenda for next Wednesday's meeting. What Michael couldn't have anticipated was Brenda's next move. While taking his rescue greyhound, Ziggy, for their evening walk, he noticed Brenda's distinctive Tesla parked outside the Johnsons' home. 20 minutes later, it was at the Patels. By the time he completed the loop around the neighborhood, she had visited 5 different houses. The next morning, the change was palpable. Lisa Johnson, who usually chatted about her garden, suddenly became intensely interested in her phone when he waved. The Patel children, who adored Ziggy, were hurriedly ushered inside when Michael passed their driveway. His invitation to the community book club was mysteriously lost, according to the apologetic text he received from the organizer. Only Agnes, his 72-year-old neighbor who'd lived in Oak Ridge since before it had an HOA, seemed immune to whatever poison Brenda was spreading. She waved him over as he collected his mail. That woman is on a crusade, Agnes said without preamble, leaning on her cane. She's telling everyone your gate is just the beginning. Says you're planning to turn your place into some kind of halfway house for ex-cons. She snorted. Ridiculous, of course, but she's got half the neighborhood convinced you're a threat to property values. But why? Michael asked, genuinely confused. It's just a gate. Ains's weathered face turned serious. It's not about the gate, dear. It's about control. Brenda doesn't handle being challenged well. She lowered her voice. 3 years ago, she had a similar vendetta against the Martinez family when they wanted to install solar panels. Claimed they were unsightly, even though you couldn't see them from the street. Poor folks ended up moving after their car was keyed twice and their mailbox was smashed. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring breeze. You think she... I don't think anything, Aidens interrupted firmly. I'm just saying history has patterns. and I've lived long enough to recognize them. She patted his arm. Document everything, and maybe get another camera or two. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, birds chirping, a gentle breeze, and sunlight that seemed to make the dew-covered grass sparkle. Michael was up early, working on his drought-resistant garden beds, approved by the landscaping committee before Brenda's presidency, and enjoying the peaceful start to his weekend. The Range Rover parked directly in front of his house, blocking his driveway, a violation of Section 5.4 of the very handbook Brenda clutched as she emerged. She wasn't alone. 3 other residents, all members of her unofficial compliance committee, waited in the vehicle, watching through the windows like audience members at a theater. Brenda had dressed for the occasion in what could only be described as HOA battle attire: pressed khakis, a polo shirt with the Oak Ridge logo, and a sun visor that said property standards in embroidered script. She carried not just the infamous violations binder, but also a measuring tape, a digital camera with a telephoto lens, and what appeared to be a small device with an antenna that Michael guessed was meant to look like some sort of technical equipment. "Good morning," Michael called out with deliberate cheerfulness. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Brenda ignored the greeting. "We're conducting a comprehensive documentation of all violations today," she announced loudly, her voice carrying across the quiet street. Several neighbors who were retrieving their morning papers paused to watch. "This property has been flagged for priority enforcement." She marched up to his gate and began an elaborate performance, measuring the height with exaggerated movements, photographing the hinges with the flash unnecessarily on, and taking notes on a clipboard while shaking her head disapprovingly. All the while, she narrated her findings into a small voice recorder. "Gate height exceeds maximum allowable by approximately 2 inches. Material appears to be industrial grade, not residential as required by Section 4.3. Color is non-standard black with undertones that don't match approved palette." Michael set down his watering can and approached the gate, staying on his side. "Good morning, Brenda. Those measurements might be more accurate if you actually extended the measuring tape instead of holding it at an angle. And if you check the guidelines, jet black is specifically listed as approved color code OE 117. A couple walking their corgi slowed their pace, clearly interested in the developing scene. From her porch, Agnes had appeared with her morning coffee, making no attempt to hide her interest. Brenda's performance faltered momentarily as she realized she had an audience that wasn't limited to her loyal committee members. She lowered her voice. "The board voted last night. This gate is non-compliant and must be removed immediately." Michael leaned against his porch column. "That's strange, because I spoke with James on the board yesterday evening around 8 p.m., and he confirmed the review meeting is still scheduled for Wednesday at 7. Brenda's eye twitched slightly. "Emergency session, which requires 24-hour notice to all board members under Article 7, Michael replied calmly. He pulled out his phone. "Would you like to see the text from James confirming he received no such notice? I believe the exact words were, 'First I'm hearing of an emergency meeting.'" The watching neighbors exchanged glances. The couple with the corgi had completely stopped now, the husband whispering something to the wife. Something in Brenda's expression changed, the calculated control slipping to reveal genuine anger. She gripped the gate with white knuckles, her voice dropping to a hiss that only Michael could hear.